Mr. President, I ask also unanimous consent that Senator Whitehouse and I be permitted to engage in a colloquy.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to address an alarming trend that I see in our national discourse. As legislators, our decisions need to be rooted in facts. Science, driven by data and rigorous analysis, needs to inform our policy making. Scientists are the one who made the U.S. the world's innovator in the last century. Scientists are the people who gave us antibiotics, for example. You like being able to use antibiotics? Well, then thank scientists. Scientists put a man on the moon, several men actually, and got them back safely. These are rocket scientists. Scientists made it possible for Americans to watch this speech on C-SPAN. That's C-SPAN, the satellite cable public affairs network, also rocket scientists. Scientists also came up with useful things like the internet. A scientist from the University of Minnesota, Nobel Prize-winning agronomist named Norman Borlaug, is credited with saving over 1 billion lives worldwide. He did this by using science to develop a high-yield, disease-resistant wheat that was planted in Pakistan and India and elsewhere around the world. And by engineering our next-generation weapon system, scientists ensure that our military will continue to be the most powerful in the world. We rely on science and scientists. And if we are to progress as a country, if we and future generations of Americans are to be healthy and prosperous and safe, we better put science right at the center of our decision-making. And yet right now, foundations and think tanks funded by the fossil fuel industry are spreading misinformation about the integrity of climate science. Much as think tanks paid by the tobacco industry, use misinformation to cast doubt about the health hazards of smoking. Ignoring or flat out contradicting what climate scientists are telling us about the warming climate and the warming planet can lead to really bad decisions on national energy and environmental policy here in Congress. So today, Senator Whitehouse and I want to take some time to talk about climate science and about the fact that a scientific consensus on climate change has been reached. Climate change is happening and is being driven by human activities. From the National Academy of Sciences to the American Meteorological Society to the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, all of our preeminent scientific institutions agree that man-made greenhouse gas emissions are warming the planet and are a threat to our economy, to our security, and to our health. So do the overwhelming majority of actively publishing climatologists. This graph, taken from a study published by the National Academy of Sciences, shows responses to the survey question, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? What you see here is that as climate expertise goes up, so does the affirmation that climate change is real and is caused by human beings. Among the most expert pool of respondents, climatologists who are actively publishing on climate change, represented by this bar right here, the rightmost bar, 97% of that category of scientists answered yes. Of course, there are a few articles published by climate skeptics in peer-reviewed journals, but the vast majority, 97%, of the peer-reviewed literature supports the notion that people are causing the Earth's climate to change. Now, what are peer-reviewed articles? Well, they are articles that scientists write after conducting experiments. The experiments are designed to test a hypothesis. If the hypothesis holds up, the scientist writes a paper describing the experiment and sends it to a professional journal. The journal then sends it to other experts in the field, peer reviewers, who see if they can tear any holes in the theory. They question the methodology, they check the math. Very often, they send the paper back with questions, and the researchers will make changes to satisfy the reviewers' inquiries. If in the end the peer reviewers think the work is sound, they recommend the paper for publication. Then after publication, other scientists in the field are free to read the paper and poke away and disprove it if they can. That's a peer-reviewed paper. And I repeat, the vast majority of peer-reviewed literature supports the notion that people are causing the Earth's climate to change, and 97% of published climatologists say yes when asked, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures?
Senator Franken, as you have pointed out, despite the efforts to mislead and create doubt, the jury is not out on whether climate change is happening and being caused by man-made carbon pollution. The verdict is in fact in, and the verdict is clear. As shown by this group of scientific organizations that signed a letter supporting our efforts to do something about carbon pollution in the Senate back in October of 2009, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Chemical Society, the Geophysical Union, the Meteorological Society, the Natural Science Collections Alliance, the Botanical Society of America. Virtually every significant scientific organization accepts that these are the facts and that the verdict is in. And indeed, there's some recent added support. The scientific community continues to examine this question, and a recent report by James Hansen and Makiko Sato says climate change is likely to be the predominant scientific, economic, political, and moral issue of the 21st century. The fate of humanity and nature may depend upon early recognition and understanding of human-made effects on Earth's climate. They continue, Earth is poised to experience strong amplifying polar feedbacks in response to moderate global warming. Thus, goals to limit human-made warming to 2 degrees Celsius are not sufficient. They are prescriptions for disaster. Another recent report, Climate Change and European Marine Ecosystem Research, reads as follows: there is no doubt that rapid global warming and ocean acidification are real, and very high confidence that both are forced by human activities and emissions of carbon dioxide. Climate change effects are especially evident in the oceans. I'll get into that later on in our colloquy a little bit further. And the levels of atmospheric CO2 are accelerating. A third report, the World Energy Outlook for 2011, says that global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions reached 30.4 gigatons in 2010, 5.3% above 2009, representing almost unprecedented annual growth. In the new policy scenario, our central scenario, CO2 emissions continue to increase, reaching 36.4 gigatons in 2035, and leading to an emissions trajectory consistent with a long-term global temperature increase, of 3.5 degrees centigrade. What does that mean? The expected warming of more than 3.5 degrees centigrade in the new policy scenario would have severe consequences. A sea level rise of up to 2 meters, causing dislocation of human settlements and changes to rainfall patterns, drought, flood, and heat wave incidents that would severely affect food production, human disease, and mortality. There are also iconic American companies that have made the considered business judgment that climate change is real and we need to prepare, but we can get more to that later in the colloquy.
Yet, in spite of all this, and these are all new reports, on top of, since this 97% number was established, yet the conservative media and some of my colleagues in Congress seem to think it's just fine to ignore what these scientists are saying. Let me illustrate this with an analogy. Say you went to a doctor, and the doctor told you, you know, you better start eating more sensibly and start exercising because you are tremendously overweight. And I see from your family history that you have a family history of heart disease. Your father died of a heart attack at an early age. So you really got to go on a diet and start working out a little bit. And you say, you know what? I'd like a second opinion. So you go to a second doctor, and he says, okay, look, you have a family history of heart disease. Your father died of a heart attack at a young age. You weigh over 300 pounds. And you smoke 3 packs a day. Your cholesterol is just out of control. Your blood pressure is through the roof. It would be just irresponsible of me as a doctor not to immediately send you to this place at Mayo Clinic that I know. And I think you got to go there. And you say, thanks, doctor, but I want a third opinion. You go to the third doctor, and the third doctor reads your chart and looks at you and goes, wow, I am amazed that you are still alive. And you say, you know what, I'd like a fourth opinion. And then you go to the fourth doctor, and you go to the fifth doctor, and you go to the sixth doctor, and you go to the seventh doctor. They're all saying the same thing. But you keep asking for more opinion. Finally, you go to the 25th doctor. And the 25th doctor says, it's a good thing you came to me because all this diet and exercise would have been a complete waste. You're doing just fine. Those other doctors are in the pockets of the fresh fruits and vegetable people. Enjoy life, eat whatever you want, keep smoking, watch a lot of TV. That's my advice to you. And then you learn that the doctor was paid his salary by the makers of Twinkies, which, don't get me wrong, are a delicious snack food and should be eaten in moderation. Am I making sense here, is what I'm asking.
And it's actually quite a good example, Senator Franken, because we have some of the phony science that has attacked the science of climate change that is actually a pretty good comparison to what you described. Take, for instance, the bogus Marshall Institute. This is an institute that was founded in 1984 by a physicist who had been the chief scientist behind the tobacco industry's campaign to convince Americans that tobacco is actually okay for you and that there was doubt about whether it would actually do you any harm. A few years later, he organized something that was called the Oregon Petition, which denied that climate change was happening. Now, they phonied up the Oregon Petition to look like official papers of the National Academy of Sciences. So the National Academy of Sciences had to take the unusual step of responding that the petition, quote, does not reflect the conclusion of expert reports of the Academy, and further that it was, quote, a deliberate attempt to mislead. So he's expert in tobacco being okay for you. Suddenly he turns up as a climate denier. He phonies up his report to look like...
Was he part of a foundation at this point?
This is funded by the Marshall Institute. There's another one. There are lots of these out there. I'll just use two examples. The other one is the Heartland Institute. It's another so-called think tank with the same backers from tobacco and the fossil fuel industry, founded also in 1984. It's written reports to try to manufacture doubt about climate science and about the risks of secondhand smoke. Heartland received nearly $700,000 from ExxonMobil through 2006. Their bogus policy documents include false claims that climate change is poorly understood and simply wrong assertions that there is no consensus about the causes, effects, or future rate of global warming. Picking just these two, but there are others in the constellation of bogus science. They're commonly funded by the Bradley Foundation, the folks who brought you the John Birch Society, by the SCAFE foundations, which are constantly behind right-wing causes, by the Olin foundations, constantly behind right-wing and against public health causes, by ExxonMobil, and by the Koch brothers. So, although it may look like different voices are appearing, it's actually the same money speaking through different fronts.
This is an interesting area. There is a well-established link between the scientists who have worked for think tanks like the George C. Marshall Institute, the Heartland Institute, and other foundations, which were funded at first by tobacco money and then since then by the fossil fuels industry. These scientists have been paid to spread misinformation in order to cast doubt. Cast doubt. That's all they got to do. On a whole host of scientific issues, first about tobacco, then about acid rain, then about the hole in the ozone layer, and now about climate change. Take tobacco, for example. Scientists were paid to testify in court that there was no proof that smoking caused cancer or was addictive, even after the industry scientists knew darn well that cigarettes were addictive and did cause cancer and heart disease. In fact, the tobacco industry was found guilty in 2004 of plotting to conceal the health risks and the addictiveness of cigarettes from the public. The judge found that the tobacco industry had, quote, devised and executed a scheme to defraud consumers and potential consumers about the hazards of cigarettes, hazards that their own internal company documents proved they had known since the 1950s. And the whole purpose of this scheme was to provide misinformation, to confuse the public, to manufacture doubt. And that is what is happening right now with climate change. Public data from the Security and Exchange Commission and from charitable organization reports to the IRS show that between 2005 and 2008, ExxonMobil gave about $9 million to groups linked to climate change denial, while foundations associated with the private oil company Koch Industries gave nearly $25 million. The third major funder was the American Petroleum Institute. All in all, the energy industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars, on lobbying against climate change legislation between 1999 and 2010, including a large spike in spending from 2008 to 2010.